Welcome to Foundation Art and Design course. I would like to mention a few words about our expectations and our desires before the interview for Foundation course. We like to see a very dynamic candidate, a candidate full of personality and passion for art and design. And above all, a deep and committed interest in exploration and manipulation, and why not, enjoyment. We are a very open-minded course. We invite students to participate in a lot of different activities, a lot of them very dynamic and very explorative. And we expect a very open attitude to experimentation and exploration of different mediums. I will talk about a few examples of what we consider to be a strong portfolio and a strong body of sketchbooks which demonstrate how the candidate is able to enter a level 3 in art education in art and design. I would like to talk now about a portfolio which we consider to be strong and belong to a candidate which demonstrates a lot of diversity and energy. Diversity in approaches and diversity in use of medium and use of and treating different subject matters. This first example here, we're dealing with observational drawing. Observational drawing perhaps with a model or perhaps with characters which are somewhere in different situations. But they're not the most traditional observational drawing. As you can see, the candidate is preparing the surface with some very gestural kind of brush strokes and paint, and then is registering the model in dry chalk. This is a more gestural example. The background is prepared with some collage, as you can see here in the background. And then, of course, we have a very gestural and experimental approach. Some examples are perhaps more illustrative. You know, this is a great use of different tones of grays and a very good use of perspective. Here, perhaps, is an example informed by some 20th century painting approaches, like Jackson Pollock and so on. This is another example of collage and mixed media, where the candidate is using a whole selection of materials and, of course, decisions. These are very good examples of the great use of dark room. These are self-developed and printed photographs in a dark room. There's some great examples of pinhole camera photography. You know, this is perhaps a more illustrative example where various elements are extracted from research, from either old posters or perhaps more different artists or newer sort of elements from popular culture. That's a great example of use of, again, mixed media. I have a lot of kind of monoprinting and collaging, and perhaps the theme is nature. This is an example of illustration where the candidate develops a character, and the character then goes through a narrative scenario and is illustrated like a comic strip. Here's a great example of treating the same subject from different approaches. It's clearly portraiture, but it's done in different mediums, as you can see. Also, there's a difference of time engagement with this particular subject. And perhaps some of the sketches are only like 10 to 20 seconds. Some are more elaborate. We use like juxtaposition of different poses and different mediums and so on. Not all the work has to be presented on an A1. We're open-minded and we're willing to look at a whole range of presentation techniques, as long as the work is presented clearly and in a clean manner and in a coherent manner and sustained by the candidate. We accept all sorts of sizes. This candidate is choosing to mount all different sizes on A1 white paper. which is great. We recommend the white paper background because we want to concentrate on the actual subject, not the color of the paper. There's a great example again of mixed media, using kind of masking tape, blocking certain areas, scratching, rolling paint around, or ink using palette knife, and so on. Very dynamic example of collage, and again, use of mixed media. Perhaps the candidate used different surfaces to create separate sections of this. We have photography, we have painting, we have like sketching on different materials. This is on tracing paper, different color paper, and perhaps some collages with photo montage. We even have charcoal and so on, and it's all kind of placed together in a quite dynamic composition. Another two good examples of observational drawing. This is perhaps zooming in and choosing a section of a very complex still life and registering, almost looking with a viewfinder. Sometimes simply just record things around you, record your fellow students, or record your mates working in the studio. Good example of use of soft charcoal with erasers, registering various objects in the studio, perhaps at home. That's a sheet presenting 4 different approaches to mixed media, not necessarily with having a figurative approach, but is an example of trying to use different techniques, different materials on the same surface. So we have embossing, we have blocking, we have painting, and perhaps we have monoprinting in certain things, and also collage taken from a different context and recontextualized on this piece of paper. So this is what we consider to be a dynamic portfolio, full of personality, full of decision-making, full of experimentation, and of a great character and passion for art and design. This candidate also presents a selection of sketchbooks for the interview. In this case, we have 3 different sketchbooks. And the sketchbooks also show development of different stages of how a person approaches a theme and develops into a project with various types of research and response to research and annotations and different tests of trying different mediums. We have paint and watercolors and textures and different tools and approaches to art and design. Sometimes is inspired and informed by historical research, the 20th century and so on, and some of the time is primary research, which is conducted independently by the candidate. This is a great example of a very complex approach to various ways of registering various approaches. It's full of annotations as well. Annotations actually complement the images and add information, which is very valuable for us, and I'm sure is very valuable for the student. The other sketchbooks are, again, full of perhaps observational drawings, different mediums, different explorations, a bit more complex situations. And sometimes not all the work has to be developed into a project, but perhaps you have a little inspiration or a little kind of interesting situations that you go through, dealing with different tones, different objects, how you apply them. It's a very dynamic and exciting object to look at. The same with the last one here. This one perhaps has a bit more research on it, from different artists, but also great responses from the candidate and the application of this research into practical things. I want to talk about a slightly different kind of portfolio. The portfolio still presents around 15 to 20 pieces of work and alongside a variety of sketchbooks. But this portfolio is perhaps more orientated towards fashion and styling and some examples of 3D work. In this piece of work here, the student presents a quite dynamic and beautiful collage. We use this like mixed medium, parts of kind of, primary research and on drawings and photographs and so on, arranged into some kind of compositional context. At this point, I want to mention something that we don't advise students to do. This work is beautifully mounted. However, on the other side, we have another piece of work mounted. And the piece of work is quite nice and dynamic and so on, but we don't advise students to mount work on both sides of the paper. It's simply because sometimes we might miss something quite important on the other side, because we tend to see the work in this kind of movement. And therefore, we might be in the situation that we miss something quite exciting and something quite important. So this is a very valuable tip. Try to mount work on just one side of your A1 paper, or A2, or whatever you want to choose. Okay, as I said, this is a slightly different approach. We can see a little bit of construction approach is beginning to happen here, and you might think, how do I present more 3D work? Well, this is a great example of documenting and photographing your 3D work against a very plain background. It's very important that your photograph is a good quality and is clearly printed, because like so, you can show all the information and all the process you've been going through for your interviewer. This is a great example of a fashion construction. And in a fashion construction, of course, we deal with a lot of 3D situations. The combination of materials is a bricolage, construction approach, and so on. Now, how do we present this kind of work in progress, which we like to see because we like to see every stage of development of a project or a particular piece of work. So the best way to present this is to actually set the garment or your construction or your sculpture against a very plain background, because the background, of course, is not important. We don't want the background to distract from the information that the main subject can give us, the interviewers, for judging a piece of work. This is yet another example of a different portfolio, and of course we encourage many different types of students to apply for Foundation in Art and Design. This portfolio deals more with 3D work and perhaps architectural work. But what I want to point out of this particular portfolio is the fact that this candidate is choosing to use plastic folders. I like to say at this point that we don't encourage the use of plastic folders for the portfolio, simply because they are a little bit impersonal and they are very reflective and they don't enable us to see the work very well and make very informed judgment about qualities of texture or perhaps use of color and even 3D modeling. Nevertheless, this is a great example of how you present a maquette as an overall view of the maquette, and then is followed down here by examples of various parts of the construction. However, I could see this a lot better if the work was not presented in plastic sleeves. So please do not spend money and time in including plastic pockets in your portfolio. I would like to mention a few words about presentation of sketchbooks. Sketchbooks are objects which suggest and illustrate a student's personality, in our opinion, a lot more than an A1 portfolio, simply because they're smaller, more intimate objects where the candidate is able to interact with at all times, sometimes on the streets, sometimes in different contexts and so on, and record and register their interests in various aspects of art and design. Sometimes It could be just contextual, where they talk about the inspiration, they talk about various art exhibitions perhaps they've seen and they found interesting, and they comment on it, you know, how like tickets and so on. Here, perhaps this deals more with, again, various art movements, various artists, various interpretations of artwork, which perhaps this student will have seen in museums or books or even film documentaries and so on. Sketchbooks are a great, insightful objects which shows how passionate and how interested the artist, the candidate rather, is interested, and how committed he is to studying art and design. Sometimes they come in very creative forms, with elastic bands, and of course we encourage creativity and individual approaches. We have here observational drawings, perhaps of friends or situations or various places, found materials, a huge diversity of approaches and uses of materials, sometimes a bit dangerous. These are beautiful, very dynamic pages in the sketchbook. Occasionally, we have people presenting samples of 3D work. You know, in this case, we have alginate plaster samples, and they presented in a sketchbook, which is not necessarily an appropriate way of doing it. There's nothing wrong with it, but don't spend time and efforts in trying to stick every single piece of ceramic onto a very fragile page of a sketchbook. If you place all these objects, your 3D samples and your 3D tests, into just a simple box with a lid, we can very easily open the box and look inside and enjoy and make informed judgment about your presentation. Because, you see, this is not a very practical way of doing it. So, if you have 3D samples, use a box or use a different device to present it, not necessarily in a sketchbook. Not everything has to be in the sketchbook. We're very open-minded. We're willing to look at a wide range of methods and ways of presenting the work. What's important is to identify qualities of the work and qualities of an attitude rather than a particular way of presenting it. As a conclusion, after all these tips and advices about the interview, I'd like to mention that we're welcoming all sorts of different people, people with passion and commitment for art and design. We like to welcome a diverse range of personalities and characters. I want the candidates to feel relaxed and feel like they're looking forward to an interview for the foundation course. I would like to mention that all the interviewers, all the teachers from the Foundation Art and Design course are very nice, open-minded people. And we are open to a lot of different approaches and personalities from the candidates. I want the candidates to feel committed, passionate, but relaxed about the interview and look forward to coming to apply and have an interview for the Foundation Art and Design course at British Higher School of Art and Design.